In the quiet haze of dawn, the marble halls of Topkapi Palace trembled with a single sound, a scream. Not the cry of war, not the pain of a wounded soldier, but the terrified voice of a 15-year-old girl. Her name was Princess Fatma Sultan, daughter of the most powerful man on earth, ruler of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. But that morning in 1623, power meant nothing. Gold walls couldn't protect her. Royal blood couldn't save her. What happened that night was never written in the history books. It was erased, buried beneath centuries of ceremony and silence. For over 600 years, the world believed that Ottoman princesses lived lives of silk and jewels, surrounded by music, poetry, and servants bowing at their feet. But behind those glittering illusions hid something far darker, a ritual that turned royal daughters into obedient shadows. That scream, the one that echoed through the palace before the sun rose, wasn't just hers. It was the echo of generations of women trapped behind golden doors, paying the price of being born into power. Tonight, we are not stepping into a fairy tale. We are stepping into a nightmare disguised as tradition, one so cruel and refined it was kept secret for centuries. This is not the story of luxury. This is not the story of glory. This is the story of Princess Fatma Sultan, the girl whose wedding night became her execution. So take a breath. Because once you enter those palace walls, there's no turning back. The first light of spring crept over Istanbul, spilling through the thin mist that hung above the Bosphorus. The city was just beginning to stir, fishermen calling to one another, the faint echo of the first prayer rolling over the rooftops, the smell of wet stone rising from the streets. Yet deep within the heart of Topkapi Palace, that morning would never be remembered for peace. It would be remembered for a sound that broke it. A single scream. Sharp. Human. Terrified. It sliced through the marble corridors like a blade, echoing from wall to wall until even the eunuchs standing guard at the gate froze. These were men who had seen executions, betrayals, the quiet cruelties of power, but this sound was different. It wasn't the scream of a prisoner or a servant. It was younger, fragile, and unbearably human. Inside the private chambers of the imperial harem, the source of that scream, a 15-year-old girl, was on her knees. Her name was Fatma Sultan, daughter of Sultan Ahmed I and granddaughter of the dynasty that had conquered half the known world. Born into silk, gold, and prayer, she had been told since birth that she carried divine blood. And yet, in that moment, the daughter of the most powerful man alive was nothing more than a frightened child. Outside her door, the scent of amber incense mixed with the cold air of dawn. Inside, everything was still, except for her breathing, sharp and ragged, echoing in the dim chamber lit by oil lamps. No one dared enter. Not even the head of the eunuchs, who stood paralyzed with fear. For what had begun that night was forbidden to interrupt. What took place within those walls was not written in the official chronicles of the Ottoman Empire. No court poet immortalized it in verse. No historian dared to record it. The empire that prided itself on its laws, its art, its divine order had a ritual so secret, so horrifying, that even its name was whispered only behind locked doors. It was the price every Ottoman princess was destined to pay, the price of being born royal, of carrying the Sultan's blood. That morning in 1623, the empire awoke to the same prayers, the same power, the same illusion of perfection. But in one room, hidden behind curtains embroidered with gold thread, a truth had been revealed, one that history itself tried to bury. For centuries, the Ottoman princesses were seen by the outside world as the ultimate image of privilege, daughters of emperors, dressed in silk, surrounded by servants, married into power. But behind those golden doors was a very different story, one of training, ritual, and fear. Princess Fatma's scream was not from a wound of the body. It was from something far deeper, the moment when her spirit was first broken. That morning marked the beginning of her sacred preparation, a ritual known only to those within the harem, a psychological initiation that transformed royal daughters into silent, obedient wives. No one beyond those walls could imagine it. How could they? From the outside, the palace was paradise, marble courtyards, perfumed gardens, fountains singing to the sky. But every inch of that beauty was designed not for comfort, but for control. Every door had 2 locks, one visible, one unseen. And every woman within the harem, from concubine to princess, learned early that luxury was just another form of captivity. Fatma had grown up hearing stories of the world beyond those gates, of scholars debating in the madrasas, of poets reciting under the stars, of her father's armies conquering distant lands. She had been told she was blessed, chosen by destiny. But now, as the heavy silence settled after her scream, she began to understand that her life was not her own. The ritual that awaited her, the one whispered about by the older women, was said to purify a princess before her marriage. In truth, it was a ceremony of unmaking. It stripped away her will, her identity, even her language, reshaping her into what the empire demanded, a vessel of alliance, not a person. No one outside the palace ever saw these preparations. No foreign ambassador ever described them, for no man was allowed beyond the threshold of the women's quarters. And so, the world went on believing in the illusion that Ottoman princesses lived lives of endless comfort, not knowing that the cost of that comfort was their silence. The palace itself seemed to conspire in hiding the truth. The walls of Topkapi were built thick not only to keep enemies out but to keep secrets in. Its corridors bent at deliberate angles to muffle sound. Its rooms were designed so that voices could not carry. It was a place where whispers could die before reaching the next door. And within that perfect architecture of silence, generations of royal daughters were molded into obedience. Fatma's cry, that spring morning, was not unique. It was one of many that had echoed across the centuries, heard by no one but the marble itself. Each time, the same ritual, the same process, the same education disguised as holiness. Each time, another princess learned that in the empire's hierarchy, even a sultan's daughter had no right to her own fate. Outside, the city glittered. Merchants shouted in the bazaars, ships entered the Golden Horn, and muezzins called for morning prayer. But inside the harem, time stood still. Fatma's mother, Fatma Sultan, one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, remained silent. She knew the ritual. She had seen it before. She had endured her own version of it. And she understood that even her power could not spare her daughter. The women of the palace, the attendants, the tutors, the elder matrons, moved like ghosts that morning, eyes lowered, voices hushed. They were witnesses to something sacred and horrifying, bound by oaths of secrecy that even death could not dissolve. Later, when chroniclers tried to reconstruct that day, all they found were fragments, coded entries in the palace medical records, mentions of bridal conditioning, notes about the princess's unusual distress. But the truth was clear between the lines. Something had happened that no one dared describe. A scream had broken through the marble calm of empire, and for a moment, it had revealed the beating heart beneath the gold. That morning became legend. Servants whispered of it for decades. Some said they could still hear the echo of her cry in the marble halls when dawn broke over the Bosphorus. But the official history said nothing. They spoke instead of the empire's glory, its victories, its order, not of the suffering hidden inside the walls that upheld it. The Ottoman Empire would last for centuries more. Its power would rise and fall. Its rulers would be immortalized in stone, its armies in song. But the daughters who lived and died within its palaces would remain unnamed, their stories erased, their voices silenced. Except one. Because one morning in 1623, a girl screamed, and the marble remembered. And though 6 centuries would pass before her story resurfaced from the archives of Istanbul, her voice had already become immortal. It was the voice of every woman who had ever been told that obedience was sacred. It was the sound of innocence breaking under the weight of empire. The sound that began a story the world was never meant to hear. The morning sun rose over Istanbul, turning the domes of mosques into glowing crowns and the waters of the Bosphorus into a mirror of liquid fire. From the outside, the city looked eternal, serene, magnificent, untouched by human sorrow. The same illusion wrapped the heart of the empire, Topkapi Palace, where the fate of millions was decided, and where every secret was buried under marble and prayer. The palace stood like a world within a world, sprawling courtyards, marble fountains, and gardens perfumed with jasmine and rose. Birds nested in the cypress trees, musicians played soft melodies at the break of dawn, and everywhere, the shimmer of gold. It was paradise built by men who believed beauty could mask cruelty. Behind those shining walls lay the imperial harem, the most guarded, most mysterious place on earth. To the outside world, it was a fantasy, a sanctuary of beauty, luxury, and desire. But for those who lived within, it was something else entirely. It was a kingdom of silence, where every smile was calculated, and every word could become a weapon. The harem was a labyrinth. Nearly 800 women lived there at its height. Slaves from the Mediterranean, noble-born captives from Europe, daughters of Ottoman viziers, and royal princesses shared the same suffocating air. Every corridor, every door, every stairway was designed to control movement. Guards stood at every junction, their eyes blank, their swords unsheathed. No one left without permission. The women inside had been taught that silence was safety, obedience was beauty, and ignorance was peace. But the truth was much darker. The harem was a machine, a political organism disguised as a paradise. At its center ruled the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, the most powerful woman in the empire. She commanded respect equal to that of a vizier, controlled access to the ruler, and determined the hierarchy of every woman under the palace roof. Beneath her, concubines fought invisible wars. Alliances were formed in whispers, rivalries born in glances, victories marked by who was chosen to spend a night with the Sultan. And yet, amidst this storm of ambition, the most trapped of all were the princesses, the blood of the dynasty itself. They were born not from love, but from duty. From their first breath, their destinies were sealed in political ink. Each one was a bargaining chip in the grand game of empire, a tool to forge alliances, pacify revolts, and secure loyalty. While the world envied their jewels, they envied the peasants who could choose whom to love. The young princess Fatma Sultan, whose scream had shattered the dawn, had grown up believing she was special. Her mother, Kozum Sultan, the legendary matriarch who would one day rule the empire from behind the veil, had raised her with the finest tutors. Fatma's days had been filled with study. She could read Arabic, Persian, and Ottoman Turkish before most girls learned to dance. She knew the geometry of the stars, could recite poetry that made scholars weep, and wrote her own verses in flawless calligraphy. She debated theology with imams and read medical texts from Alexandria. She was not only beautiful, she was brilliant. But brilliance was dangerous for a woman born into power. The palace admired her intelligence but never allowed her to use it. The scholars who praised her mind in public whispered among themselves that such gifts in a princess were a curse of curiosity. To question, to think, to want, those were luxuries the empire could not afford in its daughters. For the Ottoman dynasty, a princess was not a person. She was a symbol of imperial honor, and symbols must be flawless, silent, obedient, and pure. The harem trained them for that perfection from birth. The youngest princesses learned posture before prayer, silence before speech. They were told that the walls listened, that every step they took was recorded in the eyes of the servants. Their mothers taught them never to trust another woman, for every friendship in the harem could turn to betrayal with a single whisper. And so, when Fatma turned 15, the age the empire considered suitable for marriage, her life was no longer her own. She was to be wed not to someone she loved, but to someone chosen for her, Damat Kara Mustafa Pasha, a battle-hardened commander 20 years her senior. Mustafa Pasha had fought in Persia and the Caucasus, earning the Sultan's favor through blood and loyalty. For him, marrying the princess was a step into eternity, an elevation that would bind his name to the royal bloodline forever. For Fatma, it was the beginning of an unending night. The court poets would later describe the marriage as a union of stars and sword, the perfect blending of beauty and valor. But beneath the poetry, every woman in the palace understood the truth. This was not a wedding, it was a transaction. 3 months before the ceremony, Fatma was summoned to the Hall of Gold, where her mother and the palace elders awaited her. She was told she would soon begin her sacred education. The words sounded gentle, even noble, but the look in her mother's eyes told her otherwise. She bowed, obedient as she had been taught, but her hands trembled. From that moment forward, every trace of her identity, her laughter, her curiosity, her voice, would be stripped away. The ritual was not meant to prepare her for marriage. It was meant to erase her resistance, to ensure she entered her husband's house as an instrument of obedience, not as a woman with a will. And all of it, the silence, the submission, the transformation, would be done in the name of tradition. Outside the palace walls, the empire celebrated its power. Armies marched beneath banners of the crescent moon, scholars debated divine law, artisans carved beauty from stone. But inside, behind those gilded doors, a young girl's freedom was being sacrificed, not for faith, not for love, but for control. History would remember the Ottoman Empire for its conquests, its architecture, its poetry. Few would remember that the same empire built on order and glory had also perfected the art of quiet suffering. Each princess who entered the ritual chamber was told she was blessed, chosen by destiny. Yet what awaited them was not blessing, but breaking. They would emerge from the process as shadows of themselves, adorned, obedient, and hollow. In that silence, the empire found its stability. For the men who ruled, it was a small price to pay, the suffering of daughters to preserve the peace of nations. But for those daughters, like Fatma Sultan, It was a life sentence hidden behind silk curtains and golden walls. As the sun reached its peak above Istanbul, its light glinting off the domes of Topkapi, no one outside the palace could have imagined what those walls contained. To the world, it was still the Empire of Gold. But for Fatma and those like her, it was a prison of silk, beautiful, perfumed, and inescapable. And within that prison, the lessons of obedience were about to begin. The palace's gardens glowed beneath the afternoon sun, every petal of every rose shimmering like it had been painted by a divine hand. The fountains whispered songs of calm, and doves fluttered lazily across the marble arches. Yet amid that still perfection, Princess Fatma Sultan felt an invisible chain tighten around her throat. She was 15, and her fate had already been decided. The empire had chosen her husband, Damat Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man twice her age, hardened by years of war in Persia and the Balkans. To the court, he was the ideal match, loyal, victorious, devoted to the Sultan. To Fatma, he was a stranger carved from iron and ambition. The arrangement had been made in the Imperial Council, not in her heart. The documents were signed with royal ink, sealed with the Sultan's crest, and blessed by the court imam. The poets called it the joining of strength and grace. The viziers toasted to peace. But for the girl who would be the bride, it was the quiet beginning of her unmaking. From the moment the match was announced, Fatma's days no longer belonged to her. She was escorted everywhere, to her lessons, her prayers, even her baths. Letters from friends were read before reaching her hands. Her tutors changed. Her maids were replaced with older women trained to watch, not serve. The harem began to prepare for the wedding of a princess, the kind of event that would echo across the empire. But beneath the silks, jewels, and music, there was a different kind of preparation, one the chroniclers would never record. It began quietly, with whispers among the older women. One evening, her nurse, who had served her since infancy, wept silently while brushing her hair. When Fatma asked why, the woman only murmured, "Every princess must learn her place." At first, Fatma thought it was about etiquette, posture, or modesty. She had been trained in those since childhood: how to bow, how to speak, how to smile when spoken to. But within a week, she realized this was something else. She was summoned to the chamber of reflection, a small circular room deep within the palace, walls covered in mirrors and calligraphy. At its center waited a woman named Gulna Hatun, the chief instructor of the harem, 60 years old, her face carved with the serenity of someone who had seen too much. Gulna bowed but did not smile. "From this day forward," she said, "you are no longer the Sultan's daughter. You are a vessel of his will." Those words struck like cold water. Fatma tried to ask what she meant, but the woman's gaze silenced her. "You will learn obedience," Gulna continued. "Not as a virtue, but as your survival. The empire has no need for women who think, only for those who serve." That was the first lesson of what the palace called Terbi Mubarak, the sacred education. A ritual of transformation, passed down through generations of royal daughters, designed to reshape them from within. The training began before dawn. Fatma was awakened by a gong, her room filled with incense smoke. She was made to kneel before a mirror and repeat verses of humility, her eyes lowered, her voice trembling. Then came the physical instruction, hours of rehearsing gestures, how to bow, how to rise, how to sit in silence for hours without moving. Every motion had to be perfect, measured, graceful, and devoid of thought. If she spoke without permission, she was sent to the fasting room, a dim cell lit by a single candle, where she was left to kneel for hours until her legs trembled. If she cried, her tears were wiped away with a cloth dipped in rosewater and salt, a reminder that beauty must hide pain. Her tutors recorded everything: her posture, her tone, her reactions. Every slip, every moment of hesitation was marked in the silent scrolls of obedience. Fatma began to lose track of days. Meals arrived at fixed hours, small bowls of almonds, pomegranates, and honey meant to purify her humors. Servants no longer called her by name. They referred to her only as the bride. The empire was erasing her. And yet, amidst the silence, she tried to hold on to fragments of herself. When left alone, she would trace constellations on the marble floor with her finger, whispering the names of stars she had once studied. But even the stars seemed far away now, hidden behind the walls that grew higher each day. One evening, her mother, Kozum Sultan, came to visit. The great matriarch of the empire, a woman whose word could sway armies, stepped quietly into the room. Fatma rose, tears brimming in her eyes, but but her mother's expression was unreadable. "My daughter," Kozum said softly, "the world is not kind to women like us. We are born in gold, but we live in chains. Learn to survive within them." Fatma wanted to cry out, to ask her mother to stop this, to free her, to save her. But something in the older woman's eyes stopped her. It was not cruelty. It was resignation. Kozum knew the ritual. She had endured it herself. Power had not saved her, only silence had. When the door closed behind her mother, Fatma felt the last thread of protection snap. The next phase of her preparation took her below the palace, to the underground chambers known as the bride's vault. Few ever saw this place, a series of stone rooms where young women were conditioned before marriage. The air smelled of incense and gold water. The walls were painted with faded scenes of weddings and celestial blessings, meant to comfort those who entered. At the center of the main chamber stood a table draped in silk. Upon it, a wax figure, lifelike, sculpted with shocking detail. The instructors ordered Fatma to approach, to learn the rituals of submission. Every movement she made, her hesitation, her trembling, her tears, was written down by the silent eunuchs who observed from behind a screen. 4 weeks, this continued. Each session stripped another layer of her humanity. She stopped speaking except when commanded. She ate what she was given. She obeyed without thought. The vibrant girl who once debated scholars was fading, replaced by something quieter, emptier, the perfect bride of empire. When she was finally permitted to leave the chamber, even the sky above the courtyard felt foreign. The air was too bright, too alive. She looked at the domes of Topkapi and realized they were not crowns, they were locks on a cage. From the highest balcony, she could see the city stretching endlessly beyond the palace gates, the world she would never truly touch. And as she watched the ships drift across the Bosphorus, she wondered if anyone beyond those walls knew what the price of royal blood truly was. Soon, the wedding day would come. And with it, the night that history would remember not as celebration, but as the quiet execution of a soul. For now, the empire slept in peace, unaware that beneath its marble splendor, a child was being sculpted into a shadow. And in the distance, across the shimmering sea, the muezzin called once more for prayer, his voice echoing softly over the palace of gold, the cage of silk, and the heart of a girl learning what it meant to be owned by an empire. The first bell sounded before dawn. Its tone was low, metallic, and final, like the toll of a distant warning. That morning, Princess Fatma Sultan awoke not to the soft songs of the palace birds, but to the hollow echo of footsteps outside her door. The women had come for her. The day of her Turbai V. Mubarak, the sacred education, had begun. They entered in silence, 6 attendants draped in white veils, their faces expressionless. They did not greet her. They did not look her in the eye. They simply gestured for her to rise. One of them, an older woman with grey streaks in her hair, took her by the wrist and led her through the corridors. The air smelled of amber and poppy oil. Torches flickered along the walls. They passed through a small archway and descended a staircase that twisted downward into darkness. The marble floors grew colder with each step. At the bottom waited Gulna Hatun, the master of discipline, the same woman who had spoken to Fatma weeks before. She stood by a heavy bronze door inlaid with verses from the Quran, her hands clasped behind her back. "This is where you will learn," Gulna said, her voice as smooth as it was cruel. "And when you leave, you will no longer belong to yourself." The door opened. Inside was the Angelino Dais, the bridal chamber of instruction. It was unlike any place Fatma had seen. The walls were panelled with ebony and mother of pearl, glimmering faintly in the lamplight. Cushions of crimson velvet lined the floor. The scent of incense was thick, almost suffocating. Every object, every curtain, every pattern, seemed designed to remind her that she was no longer a princess, but a student of submission. At the center stood a low table with scrolls, mirrors, and a bronze hourglass filled with black sand. Behind it hung a golden tapestry embroidered with tulips, the emblem of purity. On it was stitched 3 words in Ottoman calligraphy: obey, endure, forget. That was the motto of the ritual. Gulna Hatun motioned to the attendants. They circled Fatma, removing her jewelry, her rings, her bracelets, the symbols of her status. Then they took a silk sash and replaced it with a plain white cord. "The color of humility," one of them whispered. For the next hours, Fatma was instructed in the rituals of reverence, 18 different postures of deference that every royal bride was expected to master. She had to bow at precise angles, 15 degrees for the Sultan, 30 for her husband, and 45 when entering sacred chambers. She practiced walking with her head tilted exactly 30 degrees downward, hands folded just below her chest, never above her heart. Every motion was timed to the sand in the hourglass. If she faltered, the attendants would stop the timer and make her repeat it again, and again, until perfection was achieved. Every mistake, Golnar reminded her, is a stain on your family's honor. By midday, Fatma's knees trembled, her back ached, and sweat glistened on her temples. Still, she kept going. To stop was unthinkable. In the hierarchy of obedience, pain was a teacher. Then came the discipline of speech. Her instructors handed her a small parchment, a list of 43 approved words. They were words of gratitude, apology, and acceptance. Thank you. Yes. As you wish. I am honored. Forgive me. Words like why, no, and please were absent. Those belonged to the world of choice, a world that no longer existed for her. From that moment, she was forbidden to speak outside the script. For every word spoken out of turn, there was a punishment. A day without food. A night without light. A week of silence enforced by isolation. And the worst punishment of all, public humiliation. At the end of the first week, Fatma was summoned before a tribunal composed of senior concubines and eunuchs. Among them sat her mother, Fatma Sultan, veiled in royal blue. She did not speak, only watched as her daughter recited the litany of obedience. Fatma's voice quivered. When she stumbled on the 10th verse, one of the attendants struck the marble with a cane, a warning. Fatma did not flinch. Remember, Golnar whispered afterward, even your mother judges you now as the empire does, not as a child, but as an asset. It was then that Fatma understood the true cruelty of her education. It did not rely on torture or blood. It relied on shame, a weapon far more permanent. But the deeper horror was yet to come. Beneath the palace lay a series of chambers known as the subterranean school, a place spoken of only in whispers. That was where the final lessons were held. Fatma was led there one night by torchlight, the air thick with damp and fear. Inside, the rooms were lined with mirrors. Wax mannequins sculpted by Venetian artisans stood along the walls, posed like lifeless figures from forgotten plays. They were dressed as brides and grooms, locked in frozen gestures of intimacy. This was the rite of reflection, the final stage of training. Here, princesses were forced to reenact the ceremonial gestures of marriage. The mannequins represented their future husbands. The attendants gave instructions in quiet, unfeeling tones. You will not resist, one said. Resistance is sin. The first time Fatma refused, she was locked alone in the dark. No food, no sound, no light, only her reflection in a mirror that she could not escape. For 2 days, she stared into her own eyes until she barely recognized the girl looking back. By the time she was released, something in her had cracked. Her laughter was gone. Her questions stopped. Her handwriting became mechanical, her steps perfectly measured. The women around her murmured that she had found discipline. But what they really meant was that she had been broken beautifully. Weeks passed. The white cord around her waist was replaced with one of gold, a sign that her training was complete. Golnar Hatun stood before her one last time, studying her like an artist inspecting her final work. You have learned well, she said. You are ready for your wedding. Fatma bowed, as she had been taught. As you wish. No one saw the tear that slipped down her cheek, or the faint tremor in her hands. Outside, the spring winds blew through the courtyards of Topkapi, carrying the scent of blooming tulips. The city hummed with a life she would never again be part of. From the minarets came the evening call to prayer, a sound she once found comforting. Now it echoed through her like a lament. The rituals were over. The sacred education had achieved its purpose. The girl who had loved astronomy, who wrote poetry about stars and wind, was gone. In her place stood a figure of stillness and grace, a creation of empire, molded not by love or faith, but by fear and obedience. And in the silence of that vast palace, the sands in the bronze hourglass ran out, marking the end of her childhood and the beginning of her life as the empire's most precious possession. The last day of winter, sunlight faded beyond the domes of Topkapi Palace. The air was heavy with incense and the faint rhythm of distant drums, the empire preparing for celebration. But for Princess Fatma Sultan, the celebration was a mirage. Her training had ended, but what awaited her was not freedom. It was confinement of a different kind, a prison woven from silk and ritual. The following morning, she was taken to the Jelen Kosku, the bride's pavilion. It stood apart from the rest of the harem, its marble walls veined with gold, its windows veiled by latticework so dense that light entered in patterns of bars. From afar, it appeared to be a sanctuary. Inside, it was a cage dressed as a temple. No sound from the outside world penetrated those walls. The laughter of servants, the songs of birds, the murmur of the Bosphorus, all were lost to silence. The moment Fatma crossed the threshold, the bronze doors closed behind her with a hollow echo that sounded too much like finality. Here, every moment of her existence was controlled. The attendants assigned to her, 10 women in identical silver robes, were not companions but watchers. They followed her everywhere, recording her actions, her tone, even her breathing. She was not allowed to wander the gardens unaccompanied. She could not open a window without permission. The bride's pavilion was designed not for comfort, but for purification, the empire's way of ensuring that a princess's body, mind, and will were prepared for marital harmony. Every morning began with ritual bathing. The water was mixed with sandalwood, amber, and poppy oil, poured over her by attendants chanting verses of purity. The oils left her skin perfumed, but her mind numb. The mixture had been crafted by alchemists from Samarkand, substances meant to calm the nerves, dull the senses, and erase resistance. After the bath, she was led to a marble dais where she was required to meditate before a mirror. Around her, tapestries depicted scenes of ideal wives, women kneeling beside their husbands, offering fruit, holding children. The symbolism was clear: devotion, fertility, obedience. In front of the mirror, she was told to perform muraqabah, a practice once meant for Sufi reflection, now corrupted into a tool of psychological control. She was to stare at her own reflection until she saw the self dissolve. At first, she resisted. She recited verses from the poets she loved under her breath, trying to hold onto her thoughts. But each day, her focus dimmed. Her reflection began to blur. After hours of staring, her face no longer looked like hers. It was someone else, someone quieter, empty, compliant. By the second week, she stopped speaking to her attendants. They did not seem to notice. Silence was considered progress. Her meals were precise, calculated like medicine: pomegranate juice to purify, almonds for clarity, goat's milk for obedience, saffron for fertility. Every ingredient was symbolic, every flavor laced with the taste of submission. She was not eating to live, she was being sculpted. At night, the pavilion transformed into a sanctuary of strange rituals. The lights dimmed, and incense smoke filled the air, blurring the boundaries between waking and dream. The attendants chanted verses about loyalty, womanhood, and destiny. Fatma sat among them, her eyes half closed, her mind swimming in the heavy scent. Sometimes she thought she saw figures moving in the smoke, other women, past brides, shadows of those who had gone through the same ritual centuries before. One evening, after the chants had ended, an attendant approached her with a silver bowl. Inside floated red petals and pieces of parchment covered in writing. "Your vows," the woman whispered. "You must drink the water that holds your promises." Fatma stared at the bowl. The ink had dissolved into the water, turning it cloudy. She hesitated, but the woman's expression never changed. Slowly, she lifted the bowl and drank. The water tasted faintly of roses and ash. It was the final step in the pavilion's ritual, the vow of silence. From that moment, she was forbidden to speak freely. Her words belonged to the empire. Days blurred into one another. The passage of time no longer mattered. The lamps burned without flame, the sun's light entered in fragments through the screens, and her thoughts seemed to fade with it. Sometimes, she remembered her childhood, her father's voice reading from the Quran, her mother laughing softly while braiding her hair, the nights she spent gazing at constellations through the open windows of the harem. But the memories began to feel foreign, like they belonged to someone else. And then, one morning, Fatma Sultan appeared again. Her mother entered the pavilion in silence, dressed in ceremonial black silk. Fatma rose, bowing deeply, as she had been taught. Fatma studied her daughter for a long time, her gaze tracing the stillness that had replaced the girl she once knew. "You have become what the empire needs," she said finally. Her voice was calm, but her eyes shimmered with something unspoken: guilt, perhaps, or grief. Fatma dared to whisper, "And what do I need, mother?" For a long moment, there was only silence. Then Fatma turned away. "You need to endure." She left without another word. That night, Fatma could not sleep. The moonlight through the lattice cast a web of golden shadows across her floor, a reminder of the world she could no longer touch. She knelt before the mirror, staring at the reflection of a stranger. The next day, her attendants began dressing her for the imperial procession. Her wedding was approaching. Gold-threaded veils, jeweled anklets, a robe embroidered with pearls, each piece weighed more than the last. The garments shimmered with luxury but felt like chains. When the final veil was lowered over her face, she could barely breathe. The eldest attendant whispered, "Do not be afraid. Every princess must pass through this night to reach peace." But Fatma knew better. She understood that the peace they spoke of was not serenity, it was surrender. Outside, the empire's drums thundered in the distance. The palace was alive with color, musicians, laughter. None of them would ever know that behind the celebration was a girl trapped in a prison too beautiful to be called cruel, and too cruel to be called beautiful. That night, as the lamps flickered and the air filled with the scent of amber and smoke, Fatma pressed her palm against the mirror and whispered, for the last time, her own name. Then she watched it vanish, swallowed by silence. And so the empire slept, its princess now perfected, obedient, adorned, erased. In the annals of Ottoman glory, the records would speak of a splendid marriage, of a princess radiant in silk and gold. But the truth would never be written, that before the wedding night, Fatma Sultan had already ceased to exist. The ritual had succeeded. The girl had become the symbol. The soul had been traded for the illusion of harmony. And the golden pavilion, the so-called sanctum of purity, stood still in the dark, humming softly with the breath of the empire's most exquisite prisoners. The morning of March 15th, 1623, dawned with the sound of trumpets echoing across Istanbul. The city woke to a spectacle of celebration, streets lined with banners of crimson and gold, fountains running with rosewater, the scent of incense and roasted almonds drifting through the air. For the people, it was a day of joy, the wedding of Princess Fatma Sultan, beloved daughter of the late Sultan Ahmed I, to the empire's most loyal commander, Damat Kara Mustafa Pasha. But inside the palace, beneath the glittering surface, the atmosphere was heavier than the silence before a storm. Fatma stood in her chamber, surrounded by attendants who moved with mechanical precision. They fastened her gown, layers upon layers of silk embroidered with pearls and gold thread, each piece symbolic, each fold deliberate. Her jewelry was set one by one, the rubies of loyalty, the emeralds of endurance, and the diamond pendant that once belonged to her grandmother. It gleamed on her chest like a chain. Every motion, every sound, felt distant. The chatter of servants, the rustle of fabric, the hum of music drifting from the courtyards, all blurred together into something unreal. The world saw a radiant princess. But in the mirror, she saw something else, a doll made for ceremony, her body adorned for a ritual she did not understand, her soul hidden behind veils of obedience. When the final layer was in place, Gulnar Hatun entered, carrying the bridal crown. It was made of white silk and gold filigree, heavy with meaning and weight alike. "Lower your head," she commanded softly. Fatma obeyed. The crown pressed down, forcing her chin toward her chest. From this moment until dawn, the princess would be known not as Fatma, but as the bride. Outside, the celebration had begun. Musicians played the Sultan's marches, poets recited verses of divine harmony, and the people of Istanbul cheered as processions of gifts, silks from Bursa, carpets from Persia, ivory from India, paraded toward the palace gates. For them, this marriage was the empire's promise of prosperity. But within Topkapi, the golden halls had turned into corridors of shadows. Fatma was escorted by eunuchs to the Hall of Radiance, where nobles and viziers awaited. The guests bowed as she entered, their faces masked with admiration and political calculation. Among them stood her mother, Kozum Sultan, watching her daughter with an expression no one could read. The air shimmered with heat and perfume. The Imam recited the verses of union, his voice steady and impersonal. Fatma's responses came softly, almost inaudibly. She repeated the words of consent that had been drilled into her for months. "I accept. I obey. I am honored." Each phrase felt like a small death. Then, at the Imam's final blessing, drums thundered, and the court erupted in cheers. The people shouted blessings from the courtyards. Cannon fire boomed from the harbour. The empire celebrated its perfection, the merging of blood and power, the illusion of divine order. Only one person did not move. Fatma remained still, her gaze empty, her hands clasped tightly around a string of amber prayer beads. That night, as the last of the guests departed and the feasts ended, the palace transformed again. The festive lights dimmed, replaced by the flicker of torches carried through the corridors. The laughter faded into murmurs. It was time for the nuptial procession, a ceremony older than memory itself. Fatma was led to the Kif Katu, the pavilion of union. The path wound through gardens perfumed with jasmine and ambergris. The torches cast long shadows that danced across the marble walls. Every step was accompanied by chanting, slow, rhythmic, ancient. The pavilion loomed ahead, an octagonal structure rising over the palace gardens, its domes glistening like molten gold. Inside, 3 levels awaited, each symbolizing a stage of the ritual: purification, surrender, and consummation. On the first level, Fatma was stripped of her jewelry and bathed in water scented with rose and sandalwood. The attendants whispered blessings, but their eyes were cold. The air was heavy with opium and musk, meant to soothe the nerves, to soften resistance. The second level was the chamber of surrender. Here, she was dressed again, not in color, but in white. Her gown, woven with golden thread, gleamed under the torchlight. Its beauty was deceptive. Sewn within were thin cords that could tighten around her waist and wrists at a moment's pull. Every part of her attire, the heavy veil, the jeweled anklets, the rigid crown, was designed not only to adorn, but to restrict. And then came the third level, the chamber of consummation. When the doors opened, Fatma froze. The room glowed dimly, lit by a circle of oil lamps. The walls were covered with tapestries depicting battles and victories, soldiers conquering cities, kings kneeling before thrones. Even here, the empire's language was domination. In the center stood a vast bed draped in crimson silk, framed by gilded columns. The sheets shimmered like blood in the torchlight. It was here that Mustafa Pasha awaited. He rose as she entered, his frame tall, his face marked by years of war. To the empire, he was a hero. To her, he was a stranger carved from duty. He bowed stiffly, the gesture of a soldier honoring the Sultan's gift. When the attendants withdrew, closing the doors behind them, the silence was absolute. Fatma stood motionless. Her hands trembled under the veil. Mustafa approached slowly, his steps echoing like thunder in the stillness. "You need not fear," he said, but his voice, though soft, carried the command of a man used to being obeyed. He lifted the veil. For a moment, their eyes met, one filled with practiced control, the other with unspeakable terror. Outside, the torches flickered. Inside, time seemed to stop. Witnesses in hidden chambers, eunuchs and physicians, as tradition demanded, recorded what followed. They would later write in coded language. The ceremony was fulfilled. The bride was silent. But the truth was darker. The girl who had endured months of ritual and silence could endure no more. Her mind detached, her body stiffened. She neither spoke nor moved, her eyes fixed on nothing. When it was over, the physicians describe her state as sakma, the separation of soul. By dawn, Istanbul rejoiced. The empire proclaimed another victory of divine order. But within the pavilion, the torches burned out, leaving only the faint smell of roses, opium, and despair. Fatma lay motionless on the bed, her golden crown fallen beside her, one hand still clutching the silk sheet as though she were holding onto the last fragment of herself. Her attendants entered silently. They bathed her, dressed her again, and led her back to her chamber, a bride, a wife, a vessel of empire. No one spoke. No one dared. As the first light of day poured through the lattice windows, Fatma's eyes stared blankly ahead. The girl who once studied the stars, who dreamed of freedom beyond the palace walls, was gone. Only her silence remained, vast, unbroken, eternal. And in the chronicles of the Ottoman court, her wedding would be remembered not as a tragedy, but as a night of splendor and harmony, proof that the empire's daughters knew their duty. A duty carved in silk, a vow written in fear, a silence that would echo for centuries to come. The first light of dawn crept into the Kif Katu pavilion, bleeding pale gold through the latticed windows. The incense still lingered in the air, heavy, stale, and suffocating, mingling with the faint scent of rosewater and opium. The night of celebration had ended, but the silence that followed was more deafening than the music that had filled the palace hours earlier. On the crimson bed, Princess Fatma Sultan lay motionless. Her gown, once pristine, was crumpled and torn. Her veil had slipped to the marble floor. Her hands were clenched against her chest, her breathing shallow and uneven. The crown had fallen beside her pillow, its pearls cracked, its gold dulled by candle wax and tears. When the attendants entered, they froze. None spoke. None dared. The ritual was complete. The empire had its bride. But what lay before them was not the radiant figure they had expected. It was a shell, a body emptied of its light. Gulna Hatun, the instructor who had overseen her training, arrived moments later. She stood at the doorway, expression unreadable, as if the sight was something she had seen many times before. Slowly, she approached, knelt beside the bed, and placed 2 fingers under Fatma's chin. "Open your eyes, my child," she whispered. Fatma's eyelids fluttered, then stilled. Her gaze drifted upward, unfocused. "She breathes," one of the attendants murmured. "But she doesn't see." The women cleaned her in silence, washing away the blood and sweat, redressing her in a fresh silk robe scented with amber. When they lifted her, her head fell limply to one side. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Later, the court physicians arrived, summoned by protocol. They examined her pulse, her eyes, her breathing, and exchanged glances heavy with what they could not say aloud. Their notes, recorded in coded language, read only, "The bride exhibits signs of sakma, the soul's departure." In modern words, it was dissociation, a total collapse of mind and spirit. By midday, the palace resumed its rhythm of celebration. The Sultan's court proclaimed the union a success. Poets recited verses of harmony. Musicians performed love songs in the courtyards. The people outside the gates rejoiced, unaware that the princess whose wedding they celebrated had already been broken. Inside the pavilion, Fatma sat upright, her back against a wall, staring into the distance. Her attendants brushed her hair, applied makeup to hide the pallor of her skin, and placed her crown once again upon her head. It was a macabre act, beauty painted over trauma. Her husband, Mustafa Pasha, entered briefly. He bowed before her, his face strained, his eyes dark with guilt and confusion. He said nothing at first. The silence between them was thicker than the air. "You are now my wife," he said finally, voice low, uncertain. "May Allah grant you peace." Peace. The word rang hollow. Fatma turned her head slightly but did not meet his eyes. Her lips parted, but the only sound that came out was a faint whisper, not in words, but in breath. Then she looked past him, as though he were no longer there. Mustafa lingered a moment, then left, his steps echoing down the corridor. Those who followed him said he did not sleep that night, nor many nights after. Days passed. Fatma was moved back to her quarters in the bride's pavilion, now a wife of the empire, but her behavior terrified the attendants. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice was barely a whisper, phrases without sense or context. "I can still hear it," she murmured one night. "The sound behind the walls." "What sound, my lady?" one attendant asked gently. "The sound of the sand in the hourglass." Her meals were left untouched. The court physicians prescribed herbal infusions, melodies played by Sufi musicians, and even poetry readings, all useless. At times, she would weep silently for hours. At others, she would sit unmoving, her gaze fixed on a patch of sunlight on the wall. The empire called it virginal melancholy, a delicate condition of noble women. But those who had seen her eyes knew it for what it was, irreversible trauma. Her mother, Fatma Sultan, visited her once. When she entered, the attendants bowed and withdrew, leaving the 2 women alone. Fatma sat by the window, her fingers tracing the lattice pattern in the light. Fatma approached quietly. "My daughter," she said, "you are safe now. You are the wife of a great man. You will be honored." Fatma turned to her, her expression calm, almost detached. "Honored," she repeated, as though testing the word. "Is this what honor feels like?" Her mother's face tightened. She knelt beside her daughter, took her hand, and whispered, "You must learn to live within silence. It is the only safety we are given." Fatma smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides pain so deep it no longer bleeds. "Then I am already safe, mother. I no longer have words." Fatma looked away. For the first time in years, the most powerful woman in the empire seemed powerless. She stayed for a long time, holding her daughter's hand, but neither spoke again. After that day, Fatma came less often. She threw herself deeper into the politics of the court, perhaps to drown her guilt. Meanwhile, Fatma withdrew further from the world. She refused visitors, avoided mirrors, and spent hours staring at the night sky from her window, though her eyes no longer searched for stars. Her servants said she began to write strange verses in the margins of her prayer books, lines that spoke of the sea, of wind, of doors that never opened. They were confiscated, burned by order of the Valide Sultan, who feared such writings might be deemed madness. But one fragment survived, hidden by a maid who pitied her. They taught me silence as prayer, obedience as virtue. But the silence is endless, and no prayer reaches God. My voice was taken, and they called it peace. As the months passed, her health deteriorated. She grew thin, fragile as glass, her hands trembling when she lifted a cup of water. The physician said her body was alive, but her spirit wandered far from it. Mustafa Pasha tried to maintain appearances. At ceremonies, he would stand beside her, proud and composed, while Fatma smiled faintly for the crowd. But when they returned to the palace, the smile vanished, and she would retreat into the shadows of her chamber, where the walls still whispered the echoes of her first scream. Years later, the same court chroniclers who glorified the empire's conquests would write of her, a woman of exceptional piety and composure, devoted to her duties, distant from worldly pleasures. But those who had known her as a child, the scholars, the poets, the servants who remembered her laughter, whispered a different truth, that the empire had not married a princess, it had buried one alive. In the quiet of the bride's pavilion, Princess Fatma Sultan became both a symbol and a ghost, the living embodiment of the cost of obedience. And though her voice had been taken, the silence she left behind would one day echo through history, a warning whispered in the marble halls of empires that rise and fall, again and again, on the backs of women taught to endure. Time moved differently within Topkapi Palace. Seasons changed outside, tulips bloomed, snow fell over the Bosphorus, ships came and went from the Golden Horn, but inside the gilded walls, everything remained the same. The courtyard still glimmered with sunlight, the fountain still whispered, and the empire still prayed at dawn. Yet for Princess Fatma Sultan, the world had ended the night she became a wife. The empire saw her as alive, but in truth, she existed only as ceremony, a breathing figure draped in silence. Months turned into years, and her life followed the rhythm of ritual. Prayer, silence, meals measured by the court physicians, appearances dictated by protocol. Her attendants had grown accustomed to her quiet presence, her predictable gestures, her endless gaze through the lattice windows toward the sea. At first, people whispered that she might recover. The princess is delicate, they said. She will adapt, as all women do. But adaptation never came. Her voice never returned. Her laughter, once the delight of the court, became a legend spoken of in past tense. When she walked through the gardens, the birds seemed to fall silent as she passed. When she appeared at ceremonies, nobles bowed deeply but avoided her eyes. There was something unsettling about her, something that reminded everyone how fragile beauty and obedience could be. Her husband, Damat Kara Mustafa Pasha, rose in rank and reputation. The empire rewarded him with new lands, honors, and a seat in the imperial council. Outwardly, he was the image of loyalty and success. But behind closed doors, he was haunted. Witnesses later wrote that the Pasha often wandered the palace at night, barefoot, half-drunk on opium and wine. He was heard whispering apologies into the empty air, to someone who never answered. Their marriage, at least in public, continued. They appeared together at feasts and festivals, their faces composed, their gestures rehearsed. But within their private chambers, they were strangers, two victims bound by duty, each bearing the empire's mark in a different way. Fatma bore children, 3 in total, 2 sons and a daughter. The chronicles recorded their births with elaborate praise. The empire rejoices in the blessings of the royal womb. But no chronicle mentioned the silence that surrounded those events. She did not hold her newborns for long. Attendants took them away after each delivery, and when she saw them again, they were toddlers raised by nurses and tutors. The palace praised her discipline. In truth, it was detachment. Fatma's children grew up calling her Valide, the formal title for a mother of royal blood, but rarely saw her. She watched them from afar, standing behind a curtain, her expression calm, her hands trembling. Once, her daughter noticed her presence and ran toward her, but the attendants intervened, reminding the child, the Valide must not be disturbed. Years later, that same daughter, now married into another noble house, would write in a private letter, "My mother's eyes followed me through the lattice. I never heard her speak, yet I felt she was screaming behind her silence." As the decades unfolded, Fatma's name appeared less frequently in official records. Historians noted her charity, donations to mosques, endowments for scholars, but always in the same detached tone. By order of the princess, funds were allocated. Her existence was reduced to gestures of piety, transactions of reputation. But those who served her intimately, the chamber women, The eunuchs who guarded her quarters witnessed a different reality. At night, she would walk barefoot across the marble floors, whispering to herself in fragments of Persian poetry and Sufi hymns. Sometimes she paused before the great mirrors of her chamber and stared for hours, as if expecting to see another woman there. Once, an attendant claimed she saw Fatma press her palm against the mirror and whisper, "You are the one who survived." Her attendants believed she was haunted, perhaps by the echoes of her own past. The older ones called her the walking silence, a ghost in silk. As her husband's political star continued to rise, Fatma's health declined. She grew pale and thin, her movement slower, her appetite nearly gone. Palace doctors prescribed elixirs of saffron, valerian, and ground pearls. None worked. When the Pasha left for campaigns abroad, she did not react. When he returned months later, covered in glory, she greeted him with the same blank courtesy. He began to avoid her chamber altogether, visiting only when custom demanded it. In private, he confessed to his aides, "I married an empire, not a woman." But deep within him, guilt festered. He funded the construction of mosques and schools in her name, perhaps believing that acts of devotion could wash away the sin of her suffering. The empire flourished, wars fought, territories gained, yet inside its most sacred palace, one of its daughters continued to fade. By 1650, Fatma Sultan was 44. Her hair had turned silver too early. Her once brilliant eyes had dulled into grey. Her children were grown, her husband often absent, and the court had nearly forgotten her. Only Kozum Sultan, now the empire's most formidable matriarch, remembered, and perhaps regretted. In her later years, Kozum ordered her daughter's quarters to be redecorated. Fresh silk drapes, ivory mirrors, new lamps. But when the workers entered the chamber, they found Fatma sitting quietly in the corner, unmoved by the bustle. She simply said, "Leave the walls. They remember me." She was right. The walls of her pavilion had heard every whisper, every prayer, every silence. On a winter morning in 1652, the attendants found her lying on her bed, motionless, her hand resting on a half-burned candle. She was 46. The official cause was written as Humma-Dimma, brain fever. But those who loved her, in the small quiet ways one could love in a palace of fear, knew better. She had simply stopped existing. The date of her death, March 15th, was the exact anniversary of her wedding. Her body was prepared according to tradition, washed in rosewater, wrapped in silk, and carried through the palace at dawn. The courtiers bowed as the procession passed, murmuring prayers. From the outside, it was another imperial ceremony, dignified, beautiful, perfect. But the few who looked closer saw something else, a strange peace on her face, as if she had finally escaped the silence that had caged her for decades. Fatma Sultan was buried beside her father, Sultan Ahmad I, in a marble tomb within the complex of the Blue Mosque, the same mosque her father had built in his youth, a monument to divine perfection. Yet, unlike her father, no inscription bore her voice, no poem marked her grave. Just a single line, carved in elegant Ottoman script. Here rests Fatma Sultan, daughter of kings, servant of God. A life summarized in one sentence, stripped of all the pain, beauty, and brilliance it once contained. For centuries, the story of Fatma Sultan would remain hidden in the shadows of imperial history, buried under titles, rituals, and euphemisms. Only fragments would survive, a few coded medical records, a handful of letters, and a whisper in the archives, that on her wedding night, the palace walls had trembled with a scream no one ever forgot. And perhaps, even now, when the sun rises over Istanbul and light touches the marble of Topkapi's harem, if one listens closely enough, the air still carries that echo, the voice of a princess who was born to rule the stars, yet was condemned to fade in silence. Empires prefer straight lines, processions that start on time, ledgers that always balance, genealogies that run clean from father to son. But life inside Topkapi refused to stay in tidy columns. Beneath the official rituals and rehearsed silences, the women of the harem, princesses, concubines, tutors, midwives, built a second world. It was not written in decrees. It moved through glances, thread, steam, and song. And there, in the seams of ceremony, grew the first quiet acts of defiance. The chronicles called it virtue when a princess never raised her voice. The physicians called it delicacy when she went pale at the sight of men. The legal scribes called it harmony when a marriage without joy lasted until death. But the women had other words, words they did not say aloud, words they stitched, steeped, and sang. It began with embroidery. The empire demanded that princesses master the needle, tulips for purity, cypresses for steadfastness, pomegranates for fertility. Yet in a dozen workshops tucked behind lattice windows, certain patterns acquired meanings never recorded by court artists. A tulip's petal tilted by a single degree could mean "I will not consent." Two cypresses, root to root, whispered sisterhood. A pomegranate split at the crown meant, "The body is not a battlefield." Robes created for betrothals carried these ghost messages in their hems, traveling the palace like letters no inspector could read. Next came ink. The harem's older women taught the princesses to write with lemon juice, drying phrases on paper that looked blank until warmed above a coal brazier. They hid these slips inside comb boxes or beneath ivory mirror backs. The messages were simple, practical, relentless. The physician who sleeps in the west corridor is kind. Do not drink the second vial at the bath. This tutor can be trusted with tears. Some were braver. I will ask for a separation. No one dared sign a name. The lemon letters often ended with the same benediction. To the one who reads, I am your sister. There were codes of steam. In the hammams, women spoke when the walls sweated and the marble throbbed with heat. A dropped copper bowl meant stop listening. A rolled towel placed on the third step meant the overseer is near. Even the rhythm of the wooden clogs on wet stone became a language. And when words were too heavy, they used song, Sufi hymns slowed to a different meter, a mismatched rhyme tucked into a couplet, turning devotion into a map of warnings. The empire wanted stories with neat endings: a betrothal, a marriage, a procession, a birth, a burial, all tied with a silk bow. The women wrote a different literature, plots without resolution, stanzas smuggled inside lullabies, beginnings that refused to become endings. From this subterranean literature came the bolder acts. One princess feigned death. Court records mention that in 1609, a royal daughter named Miraben fell suddenly ill and was laid in the cool room. What they do not say is that the pulse the physician found, slow, shallow, stubborn, had been induced. An older midwife from Uskadar had taught her a mixture of opium, saffron, and powdered pearl that slowed the breath and chilled the skin. While the pavilion wept and the muezzin's lament rose, Miraben lay like marble. At midnight, two bath women slid her onto a laundry cart under folded towels and wheeled her through the service arch. She did not escape the empire, few did, but she escaped the marriage prepared for her and lived the remainder of her life as a retired aunt in a provincial lodge, teaching girls to read the Quran and to read between lines. Another princess petitioned the law. In 1637, a petition appears in the Surya registers. A noblewoman, unnamed for honor, seeks Fasak on grounds of harm and dread. The handwriting is careful, the wording exact, learned, likely, from a sympathetic jurist aligned with Cardizadeli reformers. The case never reaches public hearing. The note ends with the quiet verdict resolved privately. What does resolved mean? No historian can say. But in the margins, a scribe drew a tiny almond eye, a mark the palace women knew. It meant she still breathes. Two sisters built a relay. Not by blood, by circumstance. One belonged to the Sultan's inner household, the other to a provincial governor's. They had met as children at a spring festival, shared a sweet, shared a secret, and were separated by rank. The relay they created used textiles as passports. A scarf embroidered with 7 small knots moved from Istanbul to Bursa to Edirne, passed from seamstress to seamstress. Each woman who carried it whispered a sentence into the silk: I am safe. I am watched. I have bruises. When the scarf returned to Istanbul, the elders gathered in a storage room between cedar chests to read it like scripture. If a message spoke of danger, they rethreaded the network: a change of tutor, a kinder midwife, a pause in the ritual that would otherwise grind forward. It was not revolution. It was triage. It saved hours, then days, then sometimes lives. There was poison, too, not for men, for myths. The women brewed a counter-narrative and fed it in spoonfuls to the young. Stories where queens refused crowns, where saints refused to marry kings, where mothers taught their daughters that God does not ask for silence as proof of virtue. These tales travelled faster than any decree. They changed not the law, but expectation. And expectation, even whispered, is a solvent. Resistance did not make the palace safer. Sometimes it made it more dangerous. A tutor dismissed for improper instruction. A bath woman transferred to a distant fort for impertinence. An old maid found praying in the wrong corridor, her name removed from the wage ledger. Yet the network adapted, as all living things do. Where eyes watched, it moved in smell, a certain blend of bay, clove, and mastic in the corridor air that meant "do not speak today." Where guards counted bodies, it moved in weight, a tray heavier by 1 copper coin signaling "follow me after prayer." Across the decades, these small resistances shaped outcomes. The archive is a desert of euphemism, but even deserts hold fossils. In the medical notebooks of 1644, a court surgeon notes that a particular princess entered the night with remarkable steadiness. Attendants report preparatory breathing taught by the elder Hafsa. Breathing, a technique smuggled from Sufi practice, taught in secret, an inner scaffold raised where the empire intended only collapse. In 1651, a robe in the treasury inventory is listed as defective, hem irregular. The hem, examined under lamp, reveals a line of pearl stitches out of pattern, a sentence in a needle's alphabet: "I am not afraid to die, I am afraid to be forgotten." Not every act sought escape. Some sought witness. A handful of women kept books of absence, vellum leaves where each page held only a date and a single name. No cause. No title. Just the reminder that a woman had stood within those walls and no longer did. The books were hidden in wall niches behind Quranic panels, wrapped in wax cloth, passed from old hands to younger. When, generations later, a scholar opened one such book, the ink still glowed brown as a bruise. What did Princess Fatma Sultan know of these undercurrents? Some, not all. In her first months as a wife, a child attendant, barely older than a page, folded a handkerchief on her pillow. 7 knots, uneven, the relay's poor imitation. Fatma unfolded it and found no words, only the knots. She pressed the cloth to her cheek and did not weep. Years later, her daughter would inherit a comb box with a false bottom. Beneath it, a lemon letter, faded to invisibility, that warmed into a single phrase over the brazier: "To the one who reads, I am your sister." The daughter, now a wife in another marble house, held the letter until the heat singed her fingers. This was the paradox the empire could never resolve. It could script the wedding, the procession, the bath, the bed. It could train the voice, narrow the vocabulary, weigh the crown, lace the gown with hidden cords. But it could not seal the spaces between women. Not all silences are submission. Some are bridges. And so, through a century of compliant records and perfect ceremonies, the palace carried an unwritten archive: the texts in thread, the letters in steam, the songs that skipped a beat on purpose, the hymns that said no. When the sultanate of women ebbed, when politics shifted and new rulers trimmed the harem's reach, officials congratulated themselves. Order restored, history corrected, the household tamed. They did not notice that the stories had changed. Little girls entering the needle rooms learned tulips and cypresses like always, and learned, too, that a tulip could tilt and a cypress could touch. Young brides drank vow water at the pavilion, and in the hammam, older hands taught them how to breathe through the night. Power insists on monuments. Resistance prefers paths. Monuments are seen. Paths are used. In the end, the women did not overthrow the empire. They did something harder. They kept one another human. They named fear without saying it, eased wounds without acknowledging them, preserved memory without writing it down. In palaces designed to turn daughters into symbols, they remained, sometimes barely, sometimes brilliantly, persons. And if you ask where their archive is kept, the answer is simple and indestructible: in the bodies that learn to breathe, in the hems that learn to speak, in the daughters who learn to read the light through lattice like a language all its own. When later historians opened the coded ledgers and found only formulas, they assumed there was nothing to tell. But somewhere in the treasury, a robe still sleeps, its edge stitched slightly wrong. Somewhere in a bath, steam gathers and a bowl falls once, and a girl knows to wait. Somewhere in the marble of Topkapi, the whisper remains: "To the one who reads, I am your sister." Centuries passed. The empires of marble and silk, the towers and pavilions of Topkapi, the men whose signatures once defined the world, all crumbled into dust. Yet somewhere inside those ruins, beneath the sound of modern footsteps and tourist laughter, the silence of Princess Fatma Sultan still lingers. Time, as the empire once taught, is a tool of control. But time also erases fear. And in the centuries that followed, the very silence that imprisoned her began to speak again, in forgotten manuscripts, in the footnotes of medical journals, in the margins of poets' diaries. The story of Fatma Sultan resurfaced not as legend, but as a wound refusing to close. In 2019, A group of Turkish archivists in Istanbul opened a sealed chest found in a neglected corridor of the Başbakanlık Osmanlı Arşivi, the Ottoman Imperial Archive. Inside lay dozens of decaying documents, marriage contracts, ritual instructions, and a faded medical ledger from the early 17th century. Between those pages was a report signed in trembling handwriting. Fatma Sultan, daughter of Sultan Ahmed, shows signs of sakma. Her pulse weakens in the presence of men. She refuses speech. She avoids mirrors. She wakes at night crying for stars. That single paragraph, clinical, cold, almost mechanical, became the key to unlocking a truth 6 centuries buried. From that discovery, historians began reconstructing the system that had long been dismissed as rumor: the sacred education, the bridal pavilion, and the 3-level ritual of union. What emerged was a pattern of psychological manipulation so intricate it could have only been designed by a civilization obsessed with control. For centuries, scholars had described the Ottoman harem as a place of beauty and intrigue, the center of feminine influence. Now it appeared, at its core, as a mechanism for silence. And Fatma Sultan was its most tragic proof. But even as the documents confirmed the cruelty of the rituals, another question arose, one that no historian could quantify. What did she think? What did she feel in those final years? To find an answer, researchers turned to fragments of poetry written in her hand, preserved by chance in a private library once owned by her tutor. The pages, brown with age, held verses that shimmered between faith and despair. The sky is vast, yet my breath is small. The stars I named as a child no longer know me. The silence they taught me grows heavier than God. It was not rebellion. It was remembrance. Even after her mind fractured, she had found a language beyond words, one that spoke in rhythm, in ache, in the quiet persistence of being alive. These rediscovered writings transformed the way history viewed the women of the Ottoman court. The Sultanate of women, once mythologized as an age of political intrigue and beauty, became instead a story of resilience under ornamentation, of minds forced to bend but refusing to break completely. As the research spread, artists, scholars, and filmmakers began revisiting her life. Yet the challenge remained: how to tell her story without turning her suffering into spectacle. How to honor the humanity of a girl buried by ceremony. To walk through Topkapi Palace today is to move through that question. The palace itself has become a museum, its walls polished, its corridors filled with guided tours and camera flashes. The harem chambers, once the heart of empire and secrecy, are now silent except for the shuffle of tourist shoes. Yet in certain corners, where the marble bears faint scratches, where the air still smells faintly of jasmine and oil, one can feel what remains. It is said that in the bride's pavilion, when the sunlight hits the wall at a certain hour, an outline appears, the faint imprint of a woman's hand pressed into the marble. Guides explain it as erosion. Others whisper it was Fatma's final mark, the last gesture of a girl reaching for the light. The truth, like so much else about her, cannot be proven. But perhaps it does not need to be. Because what matters is not proof, but presence, the undeniable persistence of her story after 6 centuries of deliberate forgetting. And it is not only Fatma. As archives opened across Turkey, Bosnia, and Egypt, other names emerged, names long erased by euphemism. Princesses listed as transferred to private residence or deceased in youth were found to have suffered identical rituals. A pattern spanning 300 years revealed itself: daughters sacrificed for alliances, their voices sealed behind silk and gold. But the same archives also revealed the other side, the quiet resistance Fatma never lived to see. Letters written by later princesses, in cautious, trembling script, invoked her name as a warning and a prayer. One fragment, dated 1731, reads, "We remember the stargazer who lost her stars. May her silence teach her speech." Fatma had become more than history. She had become memory embodied, a symbol of every woman crushed under the weight of power yet refusing to disappear. In the modern era, her story has found new voices. Feminist historians and Turkish poets resurrected her name from footnotes. Artists painted her as neither victim nor saint, but as a mirror of the eternal struggle between obedience and selfhood. Her verses were set to music, her imagined voice recited in films and performances. For the first time, Fatma Sultan, the girl whose every word had once been forbidden, was speaking again, across centuries. And what she said, through ink and echo, was simple: silence does not die. It waits to be heard. When we study the past, we often look for heroes, for people who acted, who conquered, who changed the world. Fatma did none of these things. She was not a queen, not a rebel, not a martyr. She was, instead, a witness to the violence of ceremony, the corruption of beauty, the cost of submission. In her stillness, she preserved the truth that power fears most, that even the most controlled silence still carries sound. Every empire writes its history in gold, but gold fades. The stories of its rulers are replaced, rewritten, debated. Yet the voices it tried to erase, the girls behind the veils, the wives behind the titles, they remain. Hidden in fabrics, in walls, in the echo of prayers whispered without words. Fatma Sultan's life reminds us that history is not what survives in books, but what refuses to die in memory. Today, when visitors stand beneath the domes of Topkapi and marvel at the beauty of its tiles, they often do not realize that every pattern, every petal carved into marble, carries a trace of her. The tulip motifs, once symbols of submission, are tilted, almost imperceptibly, as if the artists themselves left a secret rebellion in stone. Somewhere between myth and truth, between empire and ghost, between ritual and rebellion, she lives, not as a figure of tragedy, but as an echo that never stops returning. Because silence, when remembered, becomes voice. And voice, when passed from one generation to the next, becomes freedom. So when the sun rises over Istanbul and the first light touches the walls of the harem chambers, the marble gleams, not with the gold of conquest, but with something purer, something almost human. It gleams with the memory of a girl who once dared to look at the stars and whisper, against an empire's command, "I am still here."